Judge Howard Gates insults Pam Bondi in open court, but moments later, she strikes back, leaving him stunned and silent. The tension in the courtroom was almost tangible, a thick, suffocating force that made the very air feel heavier. Anticipation crackled through the room like static electricity before a storm. All eyes were locked on the man perched high above the bench, Judge Howard Gates. His cold sneer was carved deep into his face, an expression of superiority that seemed almost permanent. He surveyed the room with thinly veiled disdain, his eyes narrowing as Pam Bondi approached the prosecutor's table. With an almost theatrical sigh, Gates flipped lazily through the files before him, his voice dripping with arrogance as he finally spoke. "Miss Bondi," he drawled, stretching out her name like an afterthought. "Tell me you've actually brought something worthwhile today. Or is this going to be yet another colossal waste of everyone's time?" A ripple of stifled laughter swept through the defendant's team, a smug undercurrent that only added to the already suffocating tension. The gallery murmured, shifting slightly, eager to see how this would unfold. But Bondi? She didn't so much as blink. She had dealt with men like Gates before, figures cloaked in arrogance, men who wielded power like a shield, believing it would protect them from any consequences. If anything, his sneering condescension only strengthened her resolve. Her heels clicked against the polished wooden floor, each step sharp and deliberate as she reached her table. Without a word, she placed Exhibit A on the table in front of her, a thick folder filled with meticulously gathered evidence, every page a calculated blow to the case Gates so desperately wanted buried. Lifting her gaze, Bondi finally spoke. "Your Honor." Her voice was calm, composed, but there was something in her tone, something edged with a quiet, deliberate irony. "The evidence will speak for itself." Gates leaned forward, resting his chin arrogantly on his hand. His lips curled into a dismissive smirk as he scoffed. "Evidence, Miss Bondi," he sneered. "Spare me the paperwork. Numbers bore me." Bondi let a bead of silence hang in the air, letting his words linger like a challenge. Then, her voice cut through the room, steady and clear. "Bore you, Judge," she echoed, lifting a single brow. An interesting choice of words, considering these documents reveal that Charles Lawson received nearly triple the approved state budget. 6 million taxpayer dollars gone. Just like that. Vanished without a trace. A hush fell over the courtroom. The gallery erupted in hushed whispers, reporters scrambling to capture every word. Some were already scribbling feverishly in their notepads, eyes darting between Bondi and Gates. A flicker of irritation flashed across the judge's face. His fingers tightened around the gavel, his knuckles whitening beneath the harsh overhead lights. "Numbers." Gates scoffed again, shifting slightly in his seat. His gaze darted towards the defense, as if seeking silent reassurance. "Just administrative details. Move on, Miss Bondi." Bondi tilted her head slightly, allowing a slow, knowing smile to spread across her lips, cold, calculated, sharp as a blade. "Administrative details, Your Honor," she repeated. $6 million, triple the approved budget. Vanishing into thin air is hardly administrative. If anything, it's criminal. A bead of sweat formed at Gates' temple, betraying the creeping unease beneath his mask of arrogance. This wasn't just another case. This was an unraveling. And Gates? He was at the center of it. Bondi slid Exhibit A forward, her voice unwavering. "This document proves that Charles Lawson, seated behind me, received funds far exceeding authorized limits. And every single cent has your signature on it, Your Honor." The silence that followed was suffocating. Heavy. Absolute. For the first time that morning, Gates' smirk faded into a tight, defensive line. The courtroom, which had buzzed with whispers just moments ago, was now frozen in stunned silence. Bondi studied him carefully, watching as realization dawned, a slow, painful recognition of exposure. The judge slammed his gavel down with unnecessary force, the sharp crack reverberating through the room like a gunshot. "I think we've heard enough for today." But everyone in that courtroom knew better. This was just the beginning. Across the room, Gates gripped the bench as though it were the only thing tethering him to control. Bondi, on the other hand, stood tall, unshaken. The document before her was no longer just evidence. It was a noose tightening around the judge's carefully constructed facade. "Your Honor," she continued, her voice cool but cutting, "this isn't speculation. This is a signed contract, your signature." She slid another document forward. The gallery shifted again, murmurs rolling through the room like a slow-building wave. Gates exhaled sharply, his fingers flexing against the polished wood. "Miss Bondi," he said, his voice dangerously low, "I strongly advise you to tread carefully. Some battles aren't worth fighting." Bondi let his words hang there for a moment. Let them settle. Let everyone in the room feel their weight. Then, with an air of quiet finality, she responded. "And some battles," she said, her gaze locking onto his, "are worth winning." The courtroom crackled with energy. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, standing rigid in the corner, inhaled sharply. This wasn't just a trial anymore. This was an exposure. Bondi reached for another document, sliding it forward. But before she could even speak, click, a small, unassuming sound. But in that courtroom, it might as well have been an explosion. Pam Bondi's hand rested lightly on the device now sitting at the center of the prosecution table. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, almost casual, "since documentation alone doesn't seem to be enough, perhaps we should hear it directly." The air tensed. Bodies leaned forward. Breaths were collectively held. And then, the voice crackled through the speakers, low and unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how, just make sure she never gets her hands on those ledgers." A gasp. Reporters' pens skidded across notepads. Even the jury, silent observers until now, stiffened, eyes wide. But no reaction was louder than the man seated high above them all. Judge Howard Gates went rigid. His jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle twitched near his temple. His grip on the bench turned white-knuckled. "Turn that off," he barked, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. Bondi didn't move. "Is that your voice, Your Honor?" she asked smoothly. "Because it certainly sounds like you." Gates lurched forward, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a disgrace," he snapped. "That recording is inadmissible, clearly tampered with." Bondi let a slow breath escape between her lips. She met his eyes, her gaze steady. "You seem very sure of that," she mused, almost as if you already knew what it was going to say. And in that moment, everyone in that courtroom realized the truth. This wasn't just about Charles Lawson. This wasn't just about Gates. This was about something far bigger. And Gates? He had just lost control of his own courtroom. Courtroom swelled into an electric current of whispers, gasps, and frantic scribbles of reporters racing to capture every word. Fund 22. A name that held weight, a name that had been whispered in back rooms, buried in financial reports, and carefully kept out of reach. Until now. Pam Bondi didn't move right away. She let the words hang there, let the weight of what had just been said sink into every person in that courtroom. "We're all screwed. Not I'm screwed. We." Lawson had just admitted something far bigger than himself. And he knew it. Bondi's eyes stayed locked on him, her expression unreadable, but her silence was deafening. The shift in the room was palpable. No longer was this about just one corrupt businessman or one judge desperate to cover his tracks. This was bigger. Lawson exhaled, running a shaking hand down his face, his bravado now completely gone. His eyes darted to the exit once more, but there was no safety waiting for him beyond those doors. No gates. No protection. Only consequences. Bondi leaned forward, resting her arms lightly on the table. "Fund 22, she said slowly, deliberately. "Tell me more." Lawson swallowed hard, his fingers drumming anxiously against the table. He was trapped, exposed. And now there was only one way out. He licked his lips, his voice unsteady. "I need a deal." The gallery erupted in murmurs again, cameras clicking furiously. The jury sat frozen, watching history unfold in real time. Even the defense attorney, who had spent the entire trial smugly brushing off every piece of evidence, looked pale now, his hands clenched into fists. Bondi didn't flinch. "That depends," she said smoothly. "Start talking." Lawson hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Then, his shoulders sagged, and his gaze flickered toward the ceiling, like a man realizing he had no choice but to pray for mercy. And then he started to talk. Names. Numbers. Shell companies. Off-the-record meetings. Fund 22 wasn't just a slush fund, it was a pipeline. A system designed to funnel taxpayer money into private accounts, all under the guise of infrastructure and development. And the worst part? It went all the way up. The governor. 2 state senators. High-ranking officials whose signatures were buried in contracts just like Gates. Bondi listened, her face an unreadable mask of concentration. Her mind was already moving, the pieces falling into place faster than anyone in that courtroom could comprehend. Gates was just the beginning. And Fund 22? It was the key to unraveling it all. The moment Lawson finished speaking, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. Then, Bondi exhaled. "I'll see what I can do about your deal." But everyone knew there were no deals left to make that would save him. The storm had broken, and the fallout had only just begun.